On August 23rd, 2021, the streets of Atlanta were alive with celebration. It was a beautiful wedding. Guests arrived in high spirits, the air filled with laughter and music. The bride and groom stood before their loved ones, promising forever. But before the night was over, everything would change. What should have been a joyous occasion became something else entirely. A wedding meant to unite two souls instead became the scene of an unthinkable crime. What could drive a man to destroy everything on the happiest day of his life? The truth is more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. Sophia and Daniel were the kind of couple people envied. She was stunning, elegant, graceful, and effortlessly charming. There was something magnetic about her presence, a quiet confidence that made her unforgettable. People admired her beauty, but they adored the warmth behind her smile. Daniel was everything a woman could ask for: loyal, successful, deeply in love. He wasn't just a man who promised forever. He was the kind who meant every word. He saw Sophia as his world, his future. Together they were perfect, the kind of couple whose love story felt almost too good to be real. And like any perfect couple, they had the perfect life. Romantic getaways, candlelit dinners, late-night talks about the future. There were no cracks, no signs of trouble. Just two people, madly in love, planning the rest of their lives together. But perfection is an illusion. Sophia's family was always present, her mother gentle but watchful. And then there was Richard, her father, a man of power, control, and quiet authority. To everyone else, he was just a devoted father, proud, protective, involved. But something about him felt different. The way he lingered when he spoke to her, the way his presence seemed heavier than it should have been. A father's love is supposed to be protective, but sometimes protection feels a lot like possession. No one questioned it. Why would they? The family was tight-knit, loving, supportive, the kind of family people admired. And so the wedding plans moved forward. The date was set, the invitation sent. Daniel had never been happier, believing he was marrying the woman of his dreams. He didn't know. He didn't know that beneath Sophia's perfect smile was a secret so twisted, so unthinkable. It would shatter everything. The stage was set for the perfect wedding. No one knew it would end in blood. Sophia had lived her entire life under her father's control. From childhood, Richard had shaped her world, molding her into something that belonged to him. His love was possessive, suffocating, disguised as protection. What began as overbearing guidance slowly turned into something far more insidious. At first it seemed normal, at least to her. The way he held her too long, how his hands lingered when no one was looking. The way his voice softened when he spoke to her. His words too tender for a father. How his presence seemed heavier than it should. The way he made her feel like she was the only person who mattered. She had never known anything different, and so she never questioned it. But love should feel safe. This did not. Richard was careful. He never forced her. He never raised his voice. He simply convinced her, slowly, deliberately, that their bond was special, that no one else could love her the way he did, that no one else deserved to. It was subtle at first. The way he reminded her that other men would only hurt her. How he made sure no one got too close. How his affection felt like a privilege she should be grateful for. By the time she was old enough to understand what was happening, it was already too late. He had rewritten the rules of love in her mind. She didn't know how to leave, because she had never been given the choice. And so she became two people. The perfect daughter, the one who smiled, who obeyed, who never questioned his touch. And the woman who longed to be free. But freedom was an illusion. Richard was always there, reminding her, keeping her tethered to him with invisible chains. If she pulled too far, he would tighten them just enough to make sure she never forgot where she belonged. And then she met Daniel. For the first time, she felt something that wasn't tainted. With Daniel, love wasn't something that came with chains. He adored her, cherished her, saw her as someone to be loved, not owned. When she was with him, the world Richard had built around her seemed to fade, replaced with something brighter, something full of possibilities. She convinced herself that she could leave it all behind, that with Daniel, she could be normal. But Richard wasn't just a part of her past. He was still there, watching, waiting, reminding her that she belonged to him. She wanted to tell Daniel the truth. She wanted to confess everything, to beg him to save her, to take her away, to make it all stop. But every time she tried, the words never came. Richard's voice was in her head, whispering, "You think he'll love you if he knows? You think he won't leave?" And so she kept her secret. She smiled when Daniel held her close. She kissed him, let him believe he was the only one. She let herself believe it too. For a while it worked. Daniel was her escape, her lifeline. She threw herself into wedding plans, into the dream of a life where Richard no longer existed. She told herself that once she became Daniel's wife, everything would change. That Richard would finally step back, that she would finally be able to breathe. But Richard knew better. He reminded her of what they had, of what she owed him. He whispered in her ear, poisoned her thoughts, made her believe that no matter what she did, she would always be his. It wasn't love anymore. Maybe it never had been. It was a prison she had learned to live in so well that she didn't even realize she had stopped trying to escape. And so the affair didn't continue because she wanted it to. It continued because it always had, because Richard never let go, and she never learned how to break free. Still, she clung to Daniel. She planned their wedding, wore the engagement ring, told herself that once she was married, things would be different, that Richard would have no choice but to let her go. But Richard didn't lose, not to anyone. He watched her drift further away, saw her slipping into a world where he didn't exist, and he wouldn't allow it. Every time she pulled away, he pulled her back, sometimes with words, sometimes with a touch that made her stomach turn, sometimes with silence so heavy it felt like drowning. She wanted to stop. She wanted to run. But Richard had spent her entire life making sure she never would. And so, the wedding day approached. The dress was picked. The invitations were sent. Sophia smiled, laughed, kissed her fiancé, and told him how much she loved him. And Daniel, blinded by devotion, never saw the truth. Not yet. If you made it this far, let us know in the comments. Where are you watching from? We cover some of the most shocking true crime cases, and we might just feature one from your area next. It started with something small. 2 months before the wedding, Daniel noticed a message on Sophia's phone. He hadn't meant to look. He wasn't the jealous type. But something about the way she grabbed it, the slight panic in her eyes, made his stomach twist. He only saw a glimpse, a few words that made no sense. They weren't affectionate, weren't romantic, but something about them felt wrong. "You know what this is. Don't make me remind you." A chill ran through him. It sounded like a warning, but from who? He almost asked her about it. Almost. But Sophia was quick to tuck her phone away, flashing him a smile, pressing a kiss to his cheek as if nothing had happened. And so he let it go. At first, but that moment lingered in the back of his mind, gnawing at him. And the more he paid attention, the more things didn't add up. Late-night calls she always took in another room. Messages she quickly deleted. The way she seemed different. At times, he convinced himself he was imagining it. Cold feet, wedding stress. It had to be that. Sophia loved him. She wouldn't betray him. She wouldn't lie. Then 1 month before the wedding, he found it, the proof. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't something he could explain away. It was right there in front of him. An explicit text, a thread of messages, something undeniable. But it wasn't just cheating, it was something worse, something unthinkable. The sender wasn't an ex. It wasn't a stranger. It wasn't anyone who should have been speaking to her that way. It was her father. Daniel froze. His breath caught in his chest, his body going numb. He read and reread the words, each one more horrifying than the last. The way Richard spoke to her wasn't how a father should speak to his daughter. It was possessive, intimate, the kind of message a man sent to the woman he owned. His hands shook as he scrolled. He didn't want to believe it, he couldn't. But the more he saw, the worse it became. It wasn't just one message. It wasn't just one mistake. It was an affair. A lifetime of something twisted, something sick, something so disturbing that his mind refused to process it. Daniel wanted to confront her, to scream, to demand answers, to tell her that what she was doing was disgusting, vile, unthinkable. But when he looked at Sophia, All he saw was a woman who still smiled at him like she loved him. A woman who still whispered about their future, still planned their honeymoon, still acted like nothing was wrong. His world was crashing down around him, but she seemed completely untouched by it. And that was when he realized she wasn't going to tell him. She had no plans to stop, no plans to leave. If he hadn't found out, she would have walked down the aisle and carried this secret into their marriage. The woman he loved was not just unfaithful, she was something else entirely. The truth ate at him, clawed at his insides, made his skin crawl every time she touched him. And yet he said nothing, not to her, not to anyone. He woke up beside her, kissed her, held her hand, played the role of the loving fiancé, while a storm of disgust and rage brewed beneath his skin. He smiled through dinners with her family, sat across from him, the man who should have been her protector, not her lover, and said nothing. Why? Why didn't he leave? Why didn't he expose them? Why didn't he run? No one knows. Some believe he was in shock, too horrified to react. Others think he was waiting for the right moment, for the perfect time to strike. Whatever his reasons, one thing is certain. Daniel walked toward the wedding knowing the truth, and he wasn't going to let it go. The wedding was flawless. Rows of guests filled the grand hall, their faces lit with joy, their conversations a hum of excitement. White roses lined the aisle, their delicate petals scattered across the polished floor. A soft melody played as the moment everyone had been waiting for finally arrived. Sophia stood at the entrance, a vision in white. The beaded lace of her gown shimmered under the golden light, her veil cascading down like a cloud. She clutched her bouquet tightly, her smile soft, serene. No one could deny how breathtaking she looked. And at the altar, Daniel waited. His jaw was tight, his hands balled into fists at his sides. The weight of the ring in his pocket pressed against him like a stone. Every step she took toward him felt slower, heavier, as if time itself had stretched to torment him. She was walking toward him, toward their future, a future that should have been filled with love, a future he had dreamed of, a future he now knew was a lie. The closer she got, the more his mind screamed at him. The words he had discovered haunted him, twisting inside his head like a living thing, gnawing at his sanity. You know what this is. Don't make me remind you. Daniel's fingers twitched. No one watching him that day knew what was running through his mind. No one saw the storm brewing just beneath the surface. She reached him, eyes locked on his, and for a brief moment he thought he saw something in them. Fear? A flicker of hesitation? Did she know? Did she suspect? It didn't matter. The ceremony began. His vows were spoken through clenched teeth. Every word felt like poison, a mockery of the love he had once felt for her. His hands trembled as he slipped the ring onto her finger, and she, oblivious to the storm raging within him, smiled. A photographer captured the moment, the perfect illusion. And then the festivities began. Laughter filled the air. Guests raised their glasses in celebration, toasting to love, to forever. The bride and groom danced their first dance, swaying under the glow of the chandeliers. Daniel held her close, his fingers pressing into the small of her back, his grip just a little too tight. His heart pounded in his chest. The plan was already in motion. As he sat at the head table, his gaze locked onto Richard. The man sat beside Sophia, toasting the new couple, smiling like nothing was wrong, like he wasn't a monster. Daniel's fingers tightened around the gun hidden beneath the tablecloth. This was the moment. Everything led to this. And yet, he hesitated. His breath came in shallow gasps, his vision blurred. A part of him, just for a second, wanted to walk away. He saw flashes of another life, one where he never found those messages, where he never read the texts, where he still believed he was the luckiest man alive. He could leave, get in his car, never look back. But then he saw Sophia laughing, leaning toward Richard, touching his arm, her fingers grazing his wrist. Not a daughter. Something else. Daniel gritted his teeth. The laughter, the lies, the deception. Everything inside him snapped. The gun was in his hands before he even knew what he was doing. A loud crack. Richard's glass slipped from his hand, whiskey spilling across the tablecloth. Then red. His body jerked. A second later, he slumped forward, face first onto the table, blood seeping into the fabric. A gunshot rang out, echoing through the hall, then another. Chaos erupted. Sophia screamed, scrambling backward, her hands covered in her father's blood. Guests leaped from their seats, overturning tables, knocking over centerpieces. The once perfect reception turned into a battlefield. But Daniel wasn't finished. His breathing was slow, controlled, as he turned the gun on Sophia's mother. Another shot. She collapsed beside her husband, eyes wide, lips parted as if she wanted to say something. Blood pooled beneath her as her fingers twitched. The people who had allowed this deception to exist, who had stayed silent for years, were falling one by one. They weren't just family members, they were part of the sickness. They had known. They had let it happen. They had lived in the same house, seen the same signs, and did nothing. They were just as guilty. People were running now, pushing, shoving, desperate to escape. Women sobbed as they clutched their children. Men shielded their loved ones, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and fear. But Daniel only saw one thing: Sophia. She was frozen, her white dress stained red, her hands trembling. She wasn't screaming anymore. She wasn't moving. She just stood there, staring at him, eyes wide and pleading. For a second, just a second, he hesitated. And in that hesitation, she ran. She bolted, stumbling over broken glass, shoving past fleeing guests, her veil torn from her head. The ballroom doors were wide open, leading to the dark, empty night beyond. Daniel's fingers tightened around the gun. He could chase her, he could end it. But as he stood there, surrounded by the bodies of the family he had once hoped to call his own, he realized something. He didn't need to. Sophia had already lost. The truth was no longer hidden. Her father's secrets, the years of deception, everything was laid bare in the most brutal way possible. She would live with this for the rest of her life, and that, Daniel thought, was a fate worse than death. The sound of sirens filled the air, growing louder, closing in. Daniel exhaled, dropped the gun, and raised his hands. It was over. This case is one of the most chilling we've ever covered. But what about where you live? Drop your location in the comments, and we'll bring you true crime cases from your area next. The air was thick with smoke, and the metallic scent of blood when authorities arrived at the wedding hall. What had been a scene of celebration just hours earlier now resembled a massacre. Bodies lay sprawled across the shattered dance floor, the wedding cake splattered with red, toppled tables blocking the exits where panicked guests had fled. And in the center of it all stood Daniel. He didn't run. He didn't resist. He simply stood there, his hands raised, the gun slipping from his grasp, his expression unreadable. Some officers later described him as eerily calm, his face blank, his breathing even as if the bloodshed around him meant nothing. Others swore he was trembling, his chest rising and falling in frantic gasps, his hands shaking so violently he couldn't even wipe the sweat from his brow. No one could tell what was going through his mind. Sophia was the only survivor of her family. She was found outside, collapsed on the pavement, her once pristine wedding dress soaked in a mixture of blood and rain. Her screams had long since faded into silent sobs, her eyes hollow, her hands gripping at nothing. She refused to speak. Initial reports labeled the crime as a jealous rage, a groom who snapped on his wedding day, a crime of passion. But the investigation revealed something much darker. The texts, the messages, the twisted relationship between Sophia and her father. Daniel wasn't just a man betrayed, he was a man who had uncovered something unspeakable. And in his mind, he had done what had to be done. But was it justice or was it madness? The trial was unlike anything the courtroom had ever seen. The nation watched as Daniel Carter, the man once celebrated as a devoted groom, now sat in an orange jumpsuit, his wrists bound in steel cuffs. Journalists filled every seat, their cameras flashing as the prosecution laid out its case. They painted him as a cold-blooded murderer, a man who meticulously planned his revenge and executed it with precision. The evidence was clear. He had brought the gun, waited for the perfect moment, and slaughtered the family of the woman he once claimed to love. This was not self-defense, not temporary insanity. It was vengeance. But the defense had another story to tell. They called upon psychologists, character witnesses, and forensic experts to piece together the mind of a man who had uncovered the unimaginable. They argued that Daniel was a broken man, a victim of betrayal so profound that his sanity shattered. The texts, the hidden messages, the dark relationship between Sophia and her father, Richard. How could any man walk away from something like that? How could he pretend it never happened? Was he truly a murderer, or had he been pushed beyond human limits? The jury deliberated for days. When the verdict was finally read, the courtroom held its breath. Guilty of murder in the second degree. A murmur spread through the room. Not premeditated, not an execution, but still murder. Daniel Carter was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The debate didn't end with the trial. The world was divided. Some called him a monster, a man who let rage consume him. Others saw him as a tragic figure, a man whose life was ruined the moment he learned the truth. Sophia disappeared from the public eye. Some say she fled the country. Others claim she was admitted to a private institution, forever haunted by the horror of her wedding night. But one thing was certain, no one would ever forget the wedding that turned into a massacre. And Daniel? He sat in a prison cell, staring at the wall. No regrets, no remorse. Sophia was still alive. And that, he thought, was punishment enough. Love, trust, and forever. Daniel thought he had it all. But behind the veil of perfection lay a truth so twisted it shattered everything. Sophia, trapped in a past she never truly escaped, now lives with scars that time will never heal. The massacre wasn't just an act of rage, it was a brutal reminder of how secrets fester, how deception destroys. A wedding meant to mark a new beginning instead became the ultimate tragedy. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more true crime stories. Now we want to hear from you. Was Daniel a cold-blooded murderer, or was he a man who snapped after uncovering the unimaginable? Do you think his actions were justified, or did he take justice too far? Let us know in the comments below.